quite a few people from the civil service who feel, it's a step up or an opportunity to step sideways in their career. So we see that quite a bit. We get people from construction, we get people from software. So it doesn't really matter, where you're coming from. It's more interesting in kind of what your experience is to date. Because it's a broad framework is what we're trying to teach. So what you should be able to come away with is a framework that you can apply to any project and to any career. So that's what we're trying to do here. We'll do it 3 hours per week. I think it's set at a Tuesday, 6:30 to 9:30, and delivered over 12 weeks. And I'm going to break that down into 3 main components, and I'll run through those shortly. But first we'll do some foundational work, then we'll go into a number of what we're calling knowledge areas, things like project scope, cost, resources, stakeholders, things that you might have a broad knowledge of, but we'll go a little bit deeper into those, and then we'll spend the last 2 weeks doing Agile. The other thing to note is we try to build content on top of what we did the previous week. So terms that we introduce in those foundational 3 weeks we'll be using throughout the course. And we'll be going back to lean on those quite a bit. So things like the definition of a project, the way your organization manages projects, your type of organization, and the type of power a project manager might have within that organization, and how you leverage that power or some of the struggles you might come up with. So that's the type of thing we'll do in those foundational classes, and we'll build upon those, and we'll look for examples of those as we move into those knowledge areas. And again, similarly, when we go to do Agile. There is a little bit of an issue in that we have to do things sequentially. So it will require a leap of faith sometimes, and I'll call that out. So sometimes we're trying to build on top of things that we haven't done yet, but for the most part, we'll be building on things that we've worked on previously. So we'll start every week with a quick overview of what we did the week before. So just trying to, again, capitalize on some of the learnings from the previous week. We'll then do some new content, so broken down across either that foundational knowledge area or Agile content. And that's kind of the bulk of the work. That's where a lot of the discussions that we've mentioned will take place. That's where I'll be looking for kind of examples. And we'll see that in the next slide when I go to look at some of the content that we're talking about. I'll be looking for real-world examples to come from you around those areas. So it is new content, but it's also discussion. So there's time in there for discussion. And if you see that, there's kind of 95 minutes of new content per week. So it's quite a bit, and this is what I mean when I say it can get a little bit dense. So we do want to try and break it up as much as possible. After the break then, we'll basically separate into 2 different types of workshop. The first is around answering questions from the previous week. And there's 2 reasons we want to do this. So firstly, you're going to have an exam at the end, so it's a little bit of exam prep. But really it's trying to drive home the knowledge from the previous week. And we'll do it in small groups. And it'll be multiple choice questions. And those questions are trying to not just work on your knowledge or help you retain information from the previous week, but really trying to work on your judgment and impact your logical thinking about how you think and how you work as a project manager. What we're trying to do is not question so much your knowledge, yes, question your knowledge, but also try to question your judgment. And the way we do that through the questions is we'll have a question, there'll be 4 answers, more than one of them can be correct. So I don't want you just ticking A when we kind of work our way around the room. I want to hear why you chose A. What was your logic behind A is the answer? And this kind of works best when we get groups of people saying, actually, no, I chose B for this reason, and I chose C for this reason. So when we look at the questions and we break out into small groups, what we'll see a lot of is a lot of disagreement, and really healthy disagreement. And I'm looking for you to stand over your answer and explain the context or the reason why you as a group chose that answer. And that's where it starts to get interesting, where we have those conversations. And that's where we start to see some of your logic and some of your rationale coming through. And it gets, as we go through the course, kind kind of around midway, people's way of thinking starts to change. And you start to get into that mindset. And you start answering questions, not instinctively as in, what would I do? It's, what should a project manager do in this case? And that's where you start to see kind of the real learnings. So we'll do that, and then we'll end the class with a 20-minute project workshop. So the other piece of the examinable effort is going to be a project. And because this is a project management course, we're going to do a project management plan. We're going to talk early on about the life cycle of a project. And we're going to break that up into project initiation, project planning, project execution, project monitoring, and project closing. And as a project manager, so much of your work is involved in planning. So it is you plan properly up front, then you do what you said you were going to do in the plan, and then later on, or during the life cycle of your project, you monitor to see, did you do what you said you were going to do in the plan? And if not, you correct the variance. So that's going to be one of the recurring themes that we're going to see. So we are going to create a project plan. Because so much of our work as project managers is front-loaded, we want to create one. And that project plan is going to have, in terms of its content, it's going to draw content from what we do every week in the knowledge areas. So you will have a chapter in there on scope. You'll have a chapter on resources, human resources and physical resources. You'll have a chapter on cost. You'll have a chapter on schedule. So we will build on top of what we do in the new content as part of that last 20 minutes on the workshop. So we'll talk through it in practical terms, and over the course of 11 weeks, you will start to build up your own project plan and then deliver that in week 12. So our first 3 weeks, we're going to do introductions. So I'm very interested to hear kind of what backgrounds you guys are coming from, what your project management experience is to date. If the answer is none, that's fine too. Kind of where you, it doesn't have to be where you are now, it can be where you want to go. Because very often, the course changes. You know, if there's kind of a critical mass of people coming from one specific area, we can kind of pivot the course a little bit towards that as well, or kind of be aware of that when it comes to our discussions. So we'll do some introductions, figure out where it is you're coming from, where you want to go. We'll talk a little bit about some project fundamentals, things like defining what a project is, what a portfolio is, what a project management office is. We'll talk a little bit about the environments in which projects operate. So what is your organization like? Is it very siloed? Is it a matrix organization? Is it very top-heavy? Is it kind of quite a flat organization in which project managers have a lot of power? Because the nature of your organization is going to influence your ability to manage projects properly. One of the things we'll see is after we define a project, it's often very different to what people think a project is. You know, a lot of people work, and I include myself in this, work as project managers, but we don't fit that strict criteria of what a project really is. You know, it should be a temporary endeavor that has borrowed resources very often and create something unique. And very often that's not the case when we look at our real kind of day jobs. So we'll kind of take that definition in mind and try to apply that to maybe a very siloed organization. So if you're trying to borrow resources for a temporary project, how do you do that within an organization in which the resources you're borrowing you don't have direct control from? How do you kind of lead and organize as a project manager when you don't have direct control over those resources who are going to be working on your project? How do you leverage those kind of soft skills of negotiation and try to manage that as best you can for the best results of your project? So that's the environments in which projects operate. It's important because it will determine the success or failure of your project. And we'll talk a little bit in that context about the role of the project manager then. You know, there's different types of project management styles. So we'll talk about what the best style is to apply to in your context or within your organization. So that's the early stuff, week 1, 2, or 3. We'll introduce a lot of new terms, we'll introduce some definitions, so a little bit of learning in there, but they're the type of things that we're then going to use in weeks 4 to 10. Each week we'll introduce new content around these topics, and we'll go quite deep into them. We're going to look at these in the context of the life cycle of a project. And again, if you think of a project, it's almost like a curve. It starts off slow, you get approval for it, you do your planning, curve gets up, goes up, more and more people get involved, more cost gets applied to it. You then hit the execution phase or the doing phase of your project, and that's where you are actually getting stuff done. As all that's going on, you're trying to monitor and control each one of these things. So scope, schedule, cost, making sure that you're on track. So we'll talk for each one of these about how we, first of all, measure each of these, define each of these, and then how we monitor them through the life cycle of a project. And what do we do where we see variance? So we're halfway through the project, we've spent 75% of the money. What do we do for the remaining 50% of the project? How are we going to get it in on budget? Or do we accept that we're spending more than we should be, and do we have to go back to someone and ask? It's called rebaselining. And we'll do that, similar exercises across each of these, especially across the core ones of scope, schedule, and cost. We'll also look at the interdependence between them as well. And this is what I mean about kind of building on top of previous content. So what happens if our schedule moves out? We're not going to hit our dates. What's the impact to cost? What's the impact to our resources? Who do we need to communicate to? Do we need to update our risk matrix? So we'll look at that interdependence of each of these topics as well as we go through them. And that's where some of the challenge creeps in with regards to having to talk about content that we haven't covered yet. But there's not too much of that. Finally then, for the last 2 weeks or so, we will talk about Agile. So if you think about the content from the previous slide, it's quite, in project management terms, it's what's called waterfall. You kind of do one step, you have what's called a phase gate, and then you move on to the next step, and you kind of apply those steps for each of those knowledge areas that we've just gone through. The way project management is going, and the trend in the industry is very much in a more agile method, where you take the full scope of what you're trying to do, you break it down into as small parts as possible, and you try to parallelize as much of that. So we'll talk about that kind of switch, or that context from waterfall to agile project management methods. We'll talk about the different types of project lifecycle. So up to now I've been talking about it in a very linear fashion as we move from kind of initiation, planning, execution, and closing into a more predictive or agile lifecycle. And we'll talk about then how do you get people on board, because very often agile is a mindset that you need to pitch or sell within your organization. It's not just for the software engineers, it's for everyone throughout your organization, because a lot of it is about managing expectations around delivery and building trust over time in what it is your teams are delivering. So it ties back from the very last week, ties all the way back to the very first week, with trying to understand what your organization is like and how it operates, and being able to kind of leverage your power within those organizations. We'll talk about how we build trust then, if you are moving towards an agile way of working. And we do that by measuring progress and demonstrating progress over time. And then, again, similarly, how the setup and nature of your organization is going to impact your ability to deliver projects in an agile way, in an agile mindset. Sound okay? Is this content new completely? I imagine some people here are working kind of in an agile environment. Very often people, I think it sounds much better than working in a kind of a waterfall environment. So a lot of people kind of use the term agile quite loosely. So we'll try to be quite strict about our definition of it and how we implement it. The project and the exam. So we've seen already that we're going to spend kind of 20 minutes of every class building a project over time. And that content, or that workshopping that we do, it serves two purposes really. It's to reinforce the content that we're learning in class, but more importantly, it kind of builds towards this 60% that we're doing. So every week we'll take the topic we're covering and we'll try to apply it in a practical way. We'll try to demonstrate how you should manage or build a scope plan, or a costing plan, or a scheduling plan. So over the course of 11 weeks, you will build your own plan. You will start to do in real terms what it is we're talking about every day or every week in class. So there is some overhead to it. A lot of it we'll do in class, but there will be some kind of work at home required. I would say in terms of effort, if by around week 10 you could block off 2 days, you would do a quite successful project. And we'll talk about what a successful project looks like and what the difference is between a merit, a project that gets a merit, and a project that gets a distinction. So you'll be well briefed on what the expectation is from this project. So I think if you spent, well, depending on how easily distracted you are, if you spent a full day, you could, towards the end of it, having done little bits throughout the class and with the workshops, you could probably get your project boxed off and another day prepped for the exam. And I think you'd be in a very good place. But it would require quite a bit of contribution in class as well, just to keep. And the exam then, finally, multiple choice. We'll probably have around 40 questions covering all of the topics that we've covered in the previous 11 weeks. So spread across those knowledge areas, the foundational things around some of those early definitions, and some of that Agile content. And again, just to reiterate, even though it's a multiple choice question, it's very much looking to examine your judgment as well as your knowledge. But by week 12, you should be in a good place. We'll have done questions every week in class that won't be exact replicas, but will mimic the same kind of logic that you're expected to apply to the exam. So by the end of it, you'll be in a good place to pass.
If you're unable to make one of the classes, will the notes?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few things with the notes. There'll be a kind of a file repository system where we can upload notes. I quite like to use Google Slides. And the reason for that is I'd like us all to be able to see, so these are in Google Slides, I'd like us all to be able to see them and comment on them. So you'll see this, I'll have notes underneath the slides, kind of my own talking points. They'll be in there. I might have some external references as well, some links and things like that in there. But if stuff isn't making sense, I'd like one of you to be able to add a comment in there that everyone else can then see. There's some, I think you can lock down, so you won't be able to edit the content, but you can add a comment and go, what is this? I have no idea what you're talking about. Please explain it to me. So, and I'd like us to be able to do that, kind of share that. So that's my reason for preferring Google. Some people don't like it, just because Google are evil, I think. So, but if no one has any strong objections, we can move that. Or very often you can just, I can make a PowerPoint copy of these and put them up to the file repository system. All good?
Yeah.
Okay. Are we here on the AG? Good.